Debbie Clark had it all. A loving sister, a great friend to all, a nurse whose devotion to her patients was rivaled by none. Her dreams were as big as her heart, and like so many others, she yearned for a fresh start. It is a longing that brought her from small-town obscurity to the bright lights of Miami. Debbie envisioned living the life in fullness amidst glittering beaches, with promises of new beginnings. In contrast, this turns out to be quite the opposite of the brilliant future awaited at Miami. It now became a backseat story, full of betrayal and greed, ending with a murder that has stayed unsolved to date. She was a very reliable person and was dedicated to her work. She never missed one shift at the hospital, which made her absence on August 6, 1977, very suspicious. When she didn't show up for work that day, concern arose among her co-workers. This was not like Debbie. Her friends and co-workers tried calling her but received no response. By evening, their unease had grown to alarm, and they called police to report her missing. What started as a welfare check quickly escalated into a full-scale homicide investigation. When police initially arrived at Debbie's condo, everything at first glance seemed fine. The doors were locked, the windows were intact, and there was no sign of forced entry. Officer Gil Foyle, the first officer among the responding units, sought another way in. The second-floor balcony drew his attention. He climbed up and peered through the sliding glass door into a scene that would haunt him for years. Debbie lay in her bed, not moving. The serenity of the outside of the condo was in direct contrast to the horror of what was inside. It was clear that this was not an accident or a natural death as Officer Foyle entered the condo. There were clear signs of violence to Debbie's body. She had a gunshot wound to the chest, and her face and body were bruised. Her hair had been torn out in clumps, testimony to the intense struggle. Blood smeared across her chest into her face. This was a crime of rage, of personal vendetta. On the bed beside her was her empty purse, its contents spilling out. The police also discovered one chilling detail beneath her body: Debbie's own gun, hidden away as if to create a false narrative. Though the scene was chaotic, it was methodical in its message. Whoever killed Debbie had made it personal. Incomprehensible violence was the very last thing anybody who knew Debbie would have fathomed. She was known not only for her kindness but also for her deep commitment to her work as a nurse. Colleagues would say she went the second mile to take care of her patients, being compassionate and professional to each of them. Friends called her an embodiment of positivity, someone who always believed in the goodness of people, even when life was throwing its meanest battles at her. It had been an act of courage and ambition when she decided to move to Miami. She had left the small-town life, having in mind a world of limitless possibilities, professional growth, meeting new people, finding love. Miami gave her a taste of that dream, a new home, a promising relationship, the hope of building a future. That dream was tragically cut short by betrayal and greed. In no time, the investigation turned to Debbie's personal life. Her family and friends remembered her as one who brightened every room she entered. Even the brightest lives, however, have their shades. Debbie had finally divorced her ex-husband, Phil Clark, only 1 week prior to her death. That chapter in her life was well behind her, and she had moved on with another man, Alan Bregman. Alan was everything one might expect from a new romantic partner. Wealthy, charming, attentive. He had even bought the very condo where Debbie lived. To Debbie's family and friends, Alan was a catch. He had even gone so far as to travel to New York to meet her parents, discussing plans for a future together. But as detectives dug deeper, the cracks in Alan's perfect image began to show. Alan was not only seeing Debbie, but he was still married. He had a wife, Honey, and young son, part of a life that he had kept hidden from Debbie's family. While Debbie had known Alan was married, she seemed willing to accept the complexities of their relationship. What she didn't know was how deeply entwined greed and betrayal were with the man she loved. In April 1977, only 5 months prior to her murder, Debbie had purchased a life insurance policy for the sum of $148,000. Alan had convinced her to name him as the sole beneficiary. To Debbie, this may have been a sign of commitment, a way to secure their future together. But to investigators, it was a glaring red flag. Suspicion grew when they were informed that Alan had called the insurance company just 2 days after Debbie's murder, trying to collect on it. Detectives began to reconstruct a motive so chilling. Alan had played on Debbie's love and trust to stage an enterprise that would result in him richer and complication-free. Evidence seemed to show premeditation of her murder by the events and timeline leading up to and after her death. His smooth nature and calculated moves fueled the investigators to find out what really happened. As detectives worked to unravel the case, Alan seemed to provide a solid alibi. He said he was in New York, attending a Coast Guard auxiliary school. The airline tickets were there to prove it, and so was his wife Honey, who swore to his alibi. But something didn't sit right with the investigators. Alan was too calculated, too smooth. But the detectives did find something odd at Alan's house. Honey acted like she was going to shake apart every time they said Debbie's name. She gave them one more potential lead: their landscaper, Ray Sobel. Ray could have easily gained access to Debbie's condo because he had access and wouldn't have to force his way in. When detectives confronted Ray, he refused to cooperate, lawyered up, and turned out to be another dead end in a case full of open questions. With no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, the case went cold. For years, Debbie's family lived in agony, haunted by the thought that her killer might never face justice. The murder of Debbie Clark became one of Miami's many unsolved mysteries, a story of a nurse whose life was stolen in the prime of her years. But the case was far from forgotten. It would be several decades later when DNA evidence gave it a new vitality. Detectives dusted the evidence off with the hope that modern science finally gave them something it couldn't back in 1977. Among these were a photograph of a single hair found on Debbie's arm. In the time, it was just a detail, something too small to be analyzed with the resources at hand. Now, it has become the key that would unlock the truth. Extensive DNA tests were conducted on the hair, and it provided a shocking revelation. It was a familial match to Alan Bregman. The discovery gave new life to the cold case, giving detectives evidence to confront their man all these years later. Alan was 75 and living the quiet life in North Carolina when detectives showed up at his door armed with a warrant. The walls of his carefully constructed lies came tumbling down. Alan had lied about his alibi. Records showed he had changed his airline ticket, returning to Miami on the very day Debbie was murdered. The DNA evidence, combined with his suspicious behavior and the life insurance policy, painted a damning picture. Alan pleaded not guilty in court. The trial was a moment of truth not only for Debbie's family but also for the detectives who had been trying to catch her murderer all these years. The jury weighed decades-old evidence against the man who sat before them and found Alan guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict brought a mix of relief and lingering sorrow to Debbie's family. Her sister reflected on the years of pain and unanswered questions and spoke directly to the camera. "We often wonder why he won't just admit what he did. Just say he's sorry. Debbie was the best sister. She's never forgotten." The story of Debbie Clark is a grim reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how far greed can take people. Her life, which was tragically cut short, remains a testament to the importance of seeking justice, no matter how long it takes. 42 years after her death, the tangled web of betrayal, money, and power that surrounded her murder was finally unraveled, proving that the truth, though delayed, cannot be silenced. The story of Debbie Clark reminds one of how fragile life can be, how deep the betrayals of mankind can go, and how relentless the fight for justice can get. But hers is not the only case that has remained in the dark. Every year, many cold cases go unsolved, leaving scores of families to grapple with their unanswered questions and bleeding wounds. Debbie's case was solved because of relentless determination, advances in forensic technology, and the courage of her family to keep her memory alive. Her story shows us that justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied. You can be the difference if you believe the truth needs to be found, if you believe a voice needs to be given to the victims. You can support organizations that advocate for cold case investigations, better funding for forensic technology, or merely amplifying the stories of those who cannot speak for themselves. You can make a difference. Share Debbie's story, advocate for justice, and remind the world that every life, no matter how long forgotten, deserves the dignity of truth. Let her legacy inspire action, as justice is not an ideal, but a responsibility given to all. This is not the end of Debbie's quest for justice. Let this spark a movement. Stand with her and the hundreds whose stories have gone untold. Together, we can make sure that not one victim's story will ever be silenced again. It is a murder story that started with the sudden brutal end of such a promising life. So full of life, yet so deserving of so much more. Her name was Janette Kirby. Vibrant, young, full of dreams, but one fateful day. Those dreams were torn away by a monster lurking in the shadows of a Michigan forest preserve. The Michigan forest, which had always been a haven for those seeking solace and connection with nature, became a silent witness to unspeakable horror. Its tall trees, once a symbol of peace and protection, seemed to bow in mourning for Janette Kirby. The whispers of the wind carried her name, as though nature itself was grieving the loss of one of its greatest admirers. All life for Janette was a grand horizon, boundless, yearning to leave it better than the condition at birth into this world. Ironically, here is where her light gets extinguished in the woods, amidst all that promised brilliance, more than a promise of youth for the people who knew her well. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend, a lifeline to so many who cherished her goodness and optimism. Her laugh was infectious, the kind that would still linger long after a conversation. Her plans to study environmental science spoke volumes about her passion for preserving this world she so much loved. It's almost unbearable to think that the same woods she sought to protect would become the stage for her final moments. Janette's family described her as the glue that held them together, the spark at every family gathering. Her younger sister often spoke of how Janette was her role model, someone who seemed to have all the answers and could always be counted on for a word of encouragement. Her friends marveled at her energy, remembering spur-of-the-moment road trips and late-night talks that often ended in laughter and happy tears. She always had a sketchbook full of drawings of the trees, streams, and wildlife she loved, saying so many times, "If I can help save even a fraction of this beauty, my life will have meant something." Those who loved her couldn't fathom how someone so full of life could meet such a cruel end. Janette was out for what should have been a peaceful hike, a chance to really enjoy the fresh air and the serenity of nature. But that serenity shattered as Janette was dragged off the trail down into a ravine. And there, the unthinkable happened. Afternoon sun filtered through the canopy and splashed dappled shadows along the trail Janette walked. She stopped and listened to the birds chirping, the leaves rustling, the sort of symphony that always calmed her soul. It was one of those perfect moments of tranquility, the kind she could have cherished. In that instant, serenity gave way to chaos. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth, and she was pulled into the dense underbrush. Her scream was swallowed by the forest, her struggle hidden from view. The peaceful woods became a scene of terror, her fight echoes amidst the chirping cricket and swaying branches. First responders found an eerie stillness at the crime scene. The rustling of leaves and chirps of birds in the distance belied the scattered signs of violence strewn across the ravine. One of Janette's shoes was found on the trail, while another was near the body, a harrowing picture of her desperate attempt to escape. Her struggle was shown on the ground, disturbed earth and broken twigs marking a path where the life was cruelly taken from her. As investigators worked the scene, the haunting reality of Janette's final moments began to materialize. Her shoe, lost in the pathway, was loudly silent, as one would say, testifying to a run-for-her-life activity. Each broken branch and scratch on the ground portrayed her in an epic combat. It is as if the woods froze, holding a captured breath so it wouldn't give way to its inner secret, kept concealed by shade and silence. She had fought with all her might, her bravery etched in the landscape at the place where she had fallen. To the first responders, the weight of the scene was palpable and a grim reminder of evil that invaded this tranquil place. She was overpowered, subdued, and then assaulted. And to make sure she was erased from this world, as if her attacker would have it, she was stabbed. Repeatedly, relentlessly. The brutality was unimaginable. Each stab wound a mark of malice and unbridled rage. Janette's cries for help had gone unanswered, but her spirit, the will to fight back, had not gone unnoticed by the investigators. They could see it in the way she had clawed at the ground, in the defensive wounds to her arms and hands. Her attacker had sought to break her, to silence her forever, but Janette's strength in those final moments was undeniable. A quiet roar against the darkness that had sought to consume her. The brutality of the attack left even seasoned investigators shaken. Each stab wound seemed to be an expression of the killer's hatred and need for control. Many of the injuries, forensic pathologists noted, were concentrated upon areas meant to disable her quickly, thus showing a calculated way. This is not the job of somebody who acts on impulse, but that of a person who enjoyed giving pain. This was a grim look into what was going on in the thoughts of a sadistic predator. This premeditation, as revealed by forensic analysis, gave chills to the investigation team. The precision of the wounds told a story of cold calculation, of a predator who had studied his actions and executed them without hesitation. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was methodical, intentional, and deeply disturbing. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they couldn't shake the feeling that this killer had done this before, or would do it again. The realization that someone could get pleasure out of inflicting such pain put a sober urgency into the case. This wasn't just justice for Janette, it was about stopping this monster before he could take another life. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all was that she had been killed in such a brutal fashion. Her hands cuffed behind her back with police-style flex cuffs. A small, almost innocuous detail. Yet it would later surface in another harrowing case in another place, with another victim. The flex cuffs were one of those details that sent shivers down the spines of investigators. They were an instrument of control, a means of leaving a victim utterly helpless. What kind of person would carry such things on their person? One who had distorted ideas of authority or was masquerading as some figure of trust? The implications were haunting as they were baffling. These were not everyday objects, and their presence spoke volumes about a killer who planned well, who reveled in the domination of his victims. It became a driving force with the thought of those same handcuffs being applied to another in another horrific act. They had to stop him before he struck again. Years after Janette Kirby's murder, another woman would find herself staring into the face of evil. She was driving down a desolate highway as the last light of day faded from the sky. Behind her, headlights appeared, growing closer, looming in her rearview mirror. That stretch of highway was desolate, the kind of road on which time stretched endlessly and silence felt oppressive. While the lights neared closer, unease overtook the woman's being. Her eyes went mechanically to the rearview mirror again and again, as the heart raced a little faster by each ticking second. A coincidence, was it? Or was she getting followed? These surroundings were of little comfort, neither did they spell escape. An empty expanse in the road itself seemed to echo her growing trepidation, amplifying the tension within. It was a nightmare come to life. One of those surreal moments when even the darkness seemed to conspire against her. The woman said she felt overwhelming fear rise in her as the truck's flashing lights lit up brighter and brighter. At first, she wondered if she was speeding or whether there was something wrong with her vehicle, but as the driver of the truck pulled up, Calm and calculated in a baseball cap emblazoned with a star insignia, a torrent of alarm signals rang through her head. Something in her shouted, "Run!" But her cultural socialization interfered, the conditioning that dictates she listened to those clothed in authority, and that moment was to replay throughout her nightmares to come. She cranked down the window only part way, clutching the wheel tightly enough for her knuckles to whiten as his voice hit her. There was something about him, quiet, confident, that chilled her to the bone. The insignia on his cap seemed to lend an air of authority, yet it felt wrong, out of place. Her mind whirled, juggling her options. Everything she had been taught about respect for authority fought with the innate need to run. It was as if time stood still, the cold reality of her vulnerability pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. Later, she would describe the moment as one where every instinct screamed danger, but the fear of being wrong held her frozen. It was a pickup truck whose driver immediately began to flash red and white lights as if signaling her to pull over. She did, thinking it might be law enforcement. But what happened next would haunt her forever. The flashing lights of the truck cast an eerie glow on the dark asphalt. To her, an official stop. She pulled over hesitantly, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. "This is routine," she told herself, clinging to the hope there was an innocent explanation. But as the man approached, the menace in his eyes became unmistakable. Her stomach fell as dread crept into every fold of her brain. Outside her car, the world seemed to stretch out like a limitless vacuum that offered no refuge. What should have been a routine exchange was to become a fight for life. The incident escalated with terrifying rapidity. His voice was in no way loud, but commanding. He needed her out of the car. She hesitated, and the warning shot rang out, shattering all illusions of safety. Her instincts kicked in, and she resisted with everything she had. She clung to the truck, screaming for help and praying for a miracle. And then, like a beacon in the darkness, another car approached. The attacker was startled enough by the headlights to give her an opportunity to break free, a moment of pure courage that saved her life. The warning shot echoed through the still night, its sound slicing through her resolve to stay calm. Every fiber of her body screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but stay there. She clung to the doorframe of the truck, screaming as she kicked and scratched, refusing to be just another statistic. Far off, lights appeared, a vehicle approaching. She could hope that as the headlights neared, their beam cut through the darkness like salvation itself. The attack fumbled. The unexpected witness clearly threw him. It was enough. Gathering her last bit of courage, she ran toward the road, knowing that behind her lay a nightmare. Drem was arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping and assault. But as detectives began to unravel his past, they would discover a series of disturbing patterns, each one more sinister than the previous. Drem's arrest sent shockwaves into the community. For those who had heard whispers of unsolved disappearances and unexplained encounters, it was both a relief and confirmation of their worst fears. Detectives dug into his past to find a man whose life was marked by manipulation and deceit. He had the charm that cloaked the evil inside, a predator's cunning that allowed him to blend in undetected. His habits, his movements, even the tools he carried showed a pattern of calculated cruelty. What started as one case quickly unraveled into a chilling portfolio of crimes spanning years, each more terrifying than the last. As investigators began to connect the dots, a chilling profile of Drem emerged. He was a man who thrived on manipulation and control, targeting women who seemed vulnerable or isolated. While his arrest came as a relief in the community, it ripped open old wounds for families like Janette Kirby's. No longer could the extent of his atrocities be suppressed, as his links to historic offenses were unearthed. Every new discovery furthered the horrors he had inflicted over time. The profile that emerged depicted Drem as much more than a criminal. He was a predator in the truest sense of the word. He looked for women who would be alone, their guard down, and carefully contrived situations so he could easily win their confidence or simply compel them. He used control as a weapon, whether by feigned authority or with no less real intimidation. As detectives presented their findings, the families of his victims were plunged back into the depths of grief, reliving the pain of their losses. To Janette Kirby's family, the revelations brought clarity but also profound sadness. Each detail about Drem's methods underlined how much their beloved Janette had suffered, how calculated her murder had been. Yet, within the grief, there was a renewed determination to see justice served. After 16 long years, the case finally went to trial. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 3 days before delivering their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. 16 years is a long time to wait for justice, but Janette Kirby's family never gave up hope. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, like years of pain and perseverance as the trial dragged on. Prosecutors laid out the evidence against him methodically, in a tale of premeditation and cruelty that left the jury visibly shaken. Janette's mother sat hunched forward, clutching a photograph of her daughter and running her finger over its edge, as if drawing strength from her memory. The guilty of second-degree murder words were all but a collective exhalation amongst everyone when the verdict was finally brought out, and those had fought so hard to finally hear. Their tears welled in a torrent of grief let loose through joy. The words meant both victory and what had been lost. While it was finally justice served as they left the courtroom, it was a painful realization that it would never bring Janette back. Her story, however, became one of strength and a testament to the will of those that refused to let her case grow cold. Janette's memory will survive, but not just within the bosom of her near and dear ones. It would live to beam forth as that lighthouse of hope for the other families still in pursuit of their answers. Outside the courtroom, Janette's family emerged, the weight of the verdict setting in, a mix of vindication and an ache that would never subside. They remembered her bright smile, her infectious laugh, the way she lit up a room simply by being in it. Justice had come, but it could never take away that chair around their dinner table which would never be filled again. Those milestones Janette should have crossed. Yet they found some solace knowing that her story wouldn't be forgotten. Janette's case became a rallying cry for change, influencing others to speak up, to fight for the voiceless, and to make sure no case ever got cold. Her memory was a flame that burned very brightly, showing the way into hope and justice for many. The story of Janette Kirby reminds one of the fragility of life and how justice may be pursued relentlessly. But her legacy is not to make people despair. It is one of hope, resilience, and community. Though justice has been served regarding her case, there are numerous families still waiting for answers, holding on to hope that their loved ones' stories will see resolution too. If you or someone you know has information about an unsolved crime, don't stay silent. Speak up, share what you know, and be the voice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Together, we can make sure that no story goes unheard, and justice will be served to whom it is due. To learn more about how you can support cold case investigations, provide tips, or donate to organizations fighting for justice, check out. Every piece of information counts, even the smallest. We can all do something to make a difference.